Salutations, Legion of Doom. Welcome to Podcast The Storm, where socially awkward outcasts, crazy weirdos, and all-around nerds convene to talk and debate all things pop culture. With me, as always, is my co-host, the nerdy occultist, aka the Authenticator, Dalton L. Mortimer.
Good evening, everyone. We're both very tired.
And I am your host, / Time Lord Wannabe, the Brainstormer of Pop Culture. How is everyone doing tonight?
Good, I think.
Yep. Yeah, so it's kind of... I don't know how long we're going to do this. It really just depends on the articles and our opinions and stuff. I also may have some responsibilities to do with my dog during the podcast, so hopefully Dalton has enough in him to do his long-winded rants. I say that as his friend, obviously.
Yeah. No one who knows me is expecting anything but long-winded rants when I'm on point,
Right.
folks.
So we are going to finish the article we started last week. The two creators on Flying While Black, two creators on inventing and reinventing black superheroes. We covered the Eve L. Ewing part last week, and we're going to cover the next part today. That's kind of it. Let me pull it up here. Application, Chrome tab. Okay. So this part is the Black Superheroes to See Next. This by Evan Narcisi, author of the Marvel graphic novel Rise of the Black Panther. Okay. So when Black Panther hits theaters, T'Challa became a household name for millions of people. Filmgoers discuss the legacies of colonialism on the African continent, that museum scene, and the ways that Black diasporic cultures intertwine. The director Ryan Coogler's blockbuster movie showed how a costume crusader's intrinsic metaphorical power could open up new horizons. Now that the world has embraced one Black superhero, who is next? What are the other stories to be told? I have some things to say, but I'll say them when I come back. Don, you have the floor.
Okay. To start with, T'Challa is not, even cinematically, the first Black superhero, okay? Long ass before we had T'Challa in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, there was Blade. And even before that, there was Spawn. And even before that, there was Blank Man. And shortly after all of those, there was Hancock. There was Steel, although we can all be forgiven for just kind of quietly forgetting that Steel existed, because that was a very, very, very bad adaptation. But nevertheless, Black superheroes have been in the wider consciousness of the fledgling superhero genre for quite a while before Black Panther ever showed up. And that's to say nothing of Halle Berry getting to play both Storm, which she played somewhat well in the sense that they didn't really let Storm be Storm, but that's more to do with the world building of the Fox X-Men not being up to snuff than it is anything to do with more racism. And she even got to take a stab at Catwoman in that movie that we all kind of wish we could not remember because it was weird and kind of I sort of wish that Catwoman was her own character, and not in any way tied to the Batman mythos because it would work better as a standalone anti-hero, I think. But nevertheless, all of this post-colonial quasi-academic meta woo you've been spouting off, irrespective of all of that shit, which really has nothing to do with anything, the black superhero has been around in cinema about as long as every other fucking kind of superhero, for as long as those characters have existed, pretty much. The only exception being in the old days of like the black and white serials, but in the old days of the black and white serials, basically nobody got their 2 cents other than Superman, Batman, and the occasional like one-off that was of a more obscure character like Captain Marvel back when Shazam was actually called Captain Marvel, and so on. So that has nothing to do with race. And even then, during like the 60s quote unquote revolution of the superhero genre on TV, if we're talking just person of color, Kato, played by the almighty Bruce Lee, was Asian and therefore a person of color if we're operating under the rules that say Asians are people of color and not surrogate whites in this particular microsecond. So once again, clearly diversity had bumfuck nothing to do with anything. And that's not even taking into account the characters that sort of somewhat occupy the superhero genre and also sort of occupy the like crime thriller or pulp genre. Off the top of my head, I was thinking of G versus E, which was a show from like the 70s and 80s that involved 2 cops, supernatural cops, basically going around and killing demons. It's sort of like a better version of the R.I.P.D. movie that came out a couple years ago. Plus a little bit of like 70s, like Charlie's Angels-esque flair. So I don't know where you've gotten this idea that that black people have been excluded in this sort of subsection of genre at all.
Yeah. Actually, you pretty much covered everything, I guess. Thought I had something, but no.
Okay. Moving forward, I guess.
Yeah. The first waves of black superheroes started showing up in comics decades ago, dreamed up in editorial offices staffed almost entirely by white. Oh my.
Why, in the name of all of the deities, does their race matter if they are willing to produce black characters?
Yeah, that's the weirdest thing that.
And if those characters are just as 3-dimensional as every other fucking character at the time.
Right. They were Jewish, most of the guys, right?
Yeah, there was a disproportionately high number of like Hasidic Jews in the comic book industry for the longest time, right down to Siegel and Schuster, the creators of Superman, and Stan the Man Lee, who basically birthed the entirety of what we now refer to as the Marvel Universe.
Oh, and Jack the King Kirby.
Yeah. And you do not disrespect the king under any circumstances whatsoever, or we get pitchforks and torches.
No, that doesn't matter, obviously, because it disproves his point. So
Yeah, and it also, I'm sure, doesn't matter that by the time Neil Gaiman was revolutionizing the comic book industry with things like Sandman and his Black Orchid run, Karen Berger was an editor, or the fact that an entire imprint existed in the 90s called Milestone that was specifically targeted to Black creators telling Black stories or anything. And it certainly doesn't matter that one of Marvel's most popular series in the 60s and 70s happened to be Power Man and Iron Fist, which were two characters who were both based on kind of the genre exploitation era of that time period.
Mm-hmm.
I guess things just weren't diverse enough. Never mind that Martin Luther King's favorite television show and the only show he let his children watch was freaking Star Trek, and he literally personally talked the actress who played Ahura out of quitting. But sure, I guess geek culture just isn't diverse enough because reasons.
Right. Some of those trailblazing characters: John Stewart, Green Lantern, Private Intergalactic Peacekeeping Organization; Sam Wilson, Falcon, a close ally of Captain America who uses high-tech wings to fly; and Luke Cage, Power Man, and ex-con hero for hire who gains super strength and durability after a prison experiment. They all had early stories linked to the mid-century idea of the ghetto. Sorry. And were often only used when creators wanted to comment on social unrest or systemic injustice.
Oh, okay. So I don't agree with that. There are plenty of stories that exist just for the sake of making these characters awesome characters. But let's play with your own irritating strawman for 5/8 of a second here. If they had those Black characters and they didn't comment on all that socio-political unrest and all that woo, you would be bitching about that. You would be saying comics didn't take a position on the civil rights movement, or comics didn't make Black characters sympathetic enough and relatable enough to Black readers because reasons. And yet, when they do occasionally touch on those themes and those frameworks and such, you whine that they're addressing them too much. Never mind that many a Black comic book fan has loved to death those characters, and never mind that they found them relatable with or without the socio-political woo. It just doesn't matter, I guess, because we got a bunch of Jewish guys to write it instead of Black guys, even though there were Black comic book creators even back in the old days. Because this is going to baffle your minds because you keep playing victim over geek cred in the modern age, but for the longest time, being involved in geek culture was not a prestigious position. It became one because despite what every normie person on the planet thought for the longest time, geeks had a motherfucking point, and we proved it. And now that we've proven ourselves, you guys want to all swarm in and either appropriate or take the credit from us. Yeah, no thanks. You can fuck off. Comics and geek culture have always been a hub and a sanctuary for people that are otherwise dispossessed, whether they be, people who were scarred in wars like Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, or whether it be eccentric weirdos like Steve Ditko or Gardner Fox, whether it be nerfed eccentric shut-ins like H.P. Lovecraft with his, various agoraphobic tendencies and anxiety disorders and his mountains worth of mommy and daddy issues, or whether it be to, Jewish guys from New York who couldn't get their story published anywhere else, Siegel and freaking Schuster. That's comics have always filled that niche of people in the quote-unquote downtrodden parts of the world that didn't have anywhere else to go. And that's one of the reasons why comics are both so fucking weird and eccentric, but also why the people in question worked their asses off to make those stories as compelling as possible. And if you want to talk to me about comics not taking a position on sociocultural matters when it's appropriate, may I introduce you to the entirety of war comics during World War II. As Stan Lee once said in an interview for a documentary on the history of comics, they were fighting Hitler before their governments were fighting Hitler. And you may not take that away from Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, or any of the other comic book creators at the time. And the same is true of the civil rights movement, by the way, because those characters were produced at a time when the KKK was still a force to be reckoned with. It is no longer, largely thanks to the acceptance brought about by people like Gene Roddenberry in the science fiction genre and Stan Lee, Steve Ditko, and Jack Kirby in the comic book niche. Thank you very much. But do they ever get thanked for any of this work they either advertently or inadvertently did? No, they get told, well, you didn't get a black writer specifically for this, so you didn't go far enough. It doesn't matter that you were a Jew who fought in World War fucking II. You don't get to have perspective on this because reasons, I guess. That is the level of dickhead I'm getting from you, by the way. And yet, if I called you anti-Semitic for this tirade, you would not be canceled by a fucking Twitter mob because you have the right worldview, and I guess I just have the wrong one. Moving on.
Right. These heroes' primary purpose was to attract new readers to publishers like Marvel and DC. Okay?
That is the purpose of literally every character, at least on paper. That is what they are for. If your piece of art is not successfully gaining an audience, then you have failed to create adequate art. That's both creatively and financially the case. I don't know how, in the name of fuck, you are framing this as though it is either a very specific problem with minority characters or a unusual phenomena at all. Like, and more importantly, it's not a negative. It's just the simple fact of, if we want people to buy our comics, we actually need to entice them to buy our comics. If we want them to be our audience, we have to build an audience. That's the same with every freaking character under the sun. And I can tell you that obscure characters who happen to be white males don't get off any easier. My favorite character in Marvel history is Doctor Strange. You want to take a guess how many times Doctor Strange arcs were ended prematurely because nobody knew who the fuck he was outside of the extremely devoted group of eccentric nerds? Because the answer to that question would be damn near every single goddamn one of them. Thanks. Even with the movie boosting the popularity, although that's more to do with the downgrade in writing quality lately, but that's neither here nor there. Moving on.
Right. But for too long, black superheroes hewed too closely to a few shallow stereotypes. Conversations about racial and ethnic representation in mainstream media often include a common postmodern refrain: black people aren't a monolith. The same goes for black superheroes, who have the power to deftly demonstrate the multiplicity of black experiences.
Okay, so now I point out the fact, once again, if you don't force every minority character to have at least some dialogue about, I'm a minority character, then people like you complain. But to say that Falcon is the same as Blade, who is the same as Power Man, who is the same as Spawn, is fundamentally wrong. Each of these characters has their own unique personality and perspective. And quite frankly, it's kind of racist of you, playing by your own rules for a second, to say that there's no distinguishing between someone like Blade and someone like
Falcon.
Power Man. Or hell, even distinguishing from someone like Power Man and somebody like
Icon.
Yeah, would be an extremely short-sighted thing to do. Even characters who are both like on the street level kick-ass take names sort of characters, not being able to tell the difference between them would also be a problem. Saying that Spawn is the same as Luke Cage, for example, would be a remarkably stupid and short-sighted thing for you to say. And you get away with saying such things, and no one on any other side of the issue would ever get away with saying such things, and you never get called on your bullshit. This is the double standard and the lack of logic that makes everyone so angry. You demand to make these characters socio-political mouthpieces, and then when they are socio-political mouthpieces, you still complain. And you demand these characters all serve the oversoul of black identity or blackness, and yet you refuse. When you are faced with those types of characters, you refuse to tell them apart, and you demand they have individual personalities. And when someone points out to you that they have individual personalities already, you start complaining about that and saying they're not black enough, a la the BBC creative director who was bitching about Idris Elba not playing Luthor as black enough, even though the character wasn't black originally. Do you see the problem? I'm counting at least 3 layers of hypocritical cognitive dissonance here, and counting. Are you going to keep digging yourself further into this hole, or can we address the fact that black characters have gotten off no worse and no better than every other kind of character under the sun? And if you want them to get off better, then you need to stop hyper-focusing on them all serving some sort of black oversoul or over narrative, and just let them be people with their own individual lives and their own individual preferences, and not complaining when they do so. Moving on.
Right. Okay. As black creators have slowly made their way into those companies, they have used characters like Luke Cage, Misty Knight, police officer turned cyborg, Private Eye, a friend of Luke Cage, or Nubia, Wonder Woman's Black Amazon sister, to expose audiences to the facets of black life they might not ordinarily encounter. Okay, but unless it really matters to the character, it doesn't make sense to do that, though.
Yeah. And that implies there are no black comic book readers, and there have been black comic book readers for as long as comics have been a thing, pretty much. Because, once again, geek culture, and comics in particular, has always been a hub of the downtrodden and the dispossessed, because, generally speaking, the comic book industry was originally meant to cater to everyone, in particular, the working classes. And the thing about the working class is, when you've got shit to do to put food on your table and, making sure that your children have a better life than you started with, you don't give a shit about things like race and gender and all that nonsense. You've got shit to deal with. The problem is, you pseudo-intellectual academics appear to have so little to deal with in your daily lives that you can play victim points over every other demographic. And when that demographic says to you, "I'm sorry, sir, but I really would prefer not to be a victim," you shame them and you claim they have internalized self-hatred for it. When a black man says, I'm fine actually, I prefer to think of myself as a self-actualized agent, you claim he hates himself. When a disabled person says, I would like to be known for more than my disability by not paying attention to my disability for 5 seconds, if that's okay with you, you claim he has internalized self-hatred. When a gay person says, I'm sorry, but could we have gay characters who aren't all flamboyant, extremely effeminate bottom stereotypes? You claim they have internalized self-hatred. Is it at all possible that you claim this about these people not because they have internalized self-hatred, but because you see their abstract identity as more important than their actual personhood, which is the very definition of racial and demographic hatred, in case you were curious. Treating people like they are individual agents with their own individual lives and individual minds is not an artifact of hating them. It is, in fact, how you treat every motherfucker you have even the remotest amount of respect for. It's called being a human being. Why do you feel the need to prevent people from relating to people as other people? And why do you feel the need to put everyone in these identitarian boxes instead? That is it. Or those are two very important questions, in my opinion. Moving on.
Right. After growing up reading comics and then writing about them, I am now scripting superhero stories myself. Last year, when Marvel asked me to contribute to its Voices anthology series, which spotlights creators and heroes from marginalized backgrounds, I took on the same mission of exposure. I got nothing really to say to that.
Yeah, no, it's fine, and I'm glad he is successful. So moving on.
Oh, you might find this interesting. The main character in my one-page story was Jericho Drum, a black Haitian-born sorcerer who fights evil under the super sobriquet Dr. Voodoo.
Yes, I am very, very familiar with Dr. Voodoo.
All right. The character's first appearance was written and drawn by Lynn Wine and Gene Colan, who were white. To my knowledge, none of the writers or artists who had ever worked on Dr. Voodoo shared his heritage. But I do, and I made it a point to thematically connect the character back to Toussaint Louverture, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, and Barea Toya, real historical figures who birthed the movement to wrest Haiti's freedoms from French oppressors. My parents told me that our revolutionary forebears were heroes. I wanted to use Jericho Drum to introduce him to Marvel readers. Okay.
Okay, so question: since your heritage is so important to you, do you happen to know anything about Voodoo, or Haitian voodoo, as it could also be called? Do you? Because okay, here is an interesting question. What is more important to a character like Jericho Drum? The fact that he is of Haitian descent, or the fact that he is a Hungan, which is essentially a term for a voodoo priest. There are a couple different sort of subcategories of voodoo priests. Hungan are basically servants of the Radaloa. And you want to know how I know that? It's because I actually study various kinds of magic and magic practicing religions. Admittedly, voodoo is not my area, but I am somewhat more familiar with its sister traditions like hoodoo conjure, less so Appalachian granny magic, but also a little bit, and I do stress a little bit of Santeria, and I know sort of the broad strokes, like mythos of voodoo. And more to the point, would you complain if you got someone in there who happened to be white, who was also a hoodoo man or a conjure doctor or a New Orleans voodoo practitioner? Because if you genuinely cared about the more important aspect of the character, the fact that he is a voodoo priest, you would not you would want somebody who was knowledgeable about those things, irrespective of their race, if at all possible. And if you really, really honestly cared, you would be willing to raise a stink over the person in question being a practitioner of New Orleans voodoo instead of Haitian voodoo, because they're not quite the same thing. But you don't care, it seems. You're just virtue signaling about your family legacy. Not saying your family legacy isn't important, but I am saying if you're going to raise such a stink over what defines the character and that being reflected in the writer and the perspective of the writer writing it, then why are you focusing more on his race than you are on the actual traditions that are necessary for a character like Jericho to exist, namely the traditions of Haitian voodoo, and specifically the ones that focus on the Rata Loa, because he is a Hungan. He is the Hungan Supreme of Haiti. I'm guessing you didn't know or didn't care about any of this, and therein lies the problem. You can see what I look like, and yet I am more well versed in your traditions than you are. I'm not saying I'm an expert, but I am saying that I am willing to do research on areas that you apparently didn't even think to do research on, and that's the problem. You cannot tell a person's perspective from their demographic information. If a white person was raised in the middle of Haiti with a family that practiced Haitian voodoo or voodoo, they would be more well equipped to write a character like Jericho Drum than the blackest black person from the middle of Africa or from Harlem, because race has next to nothing to do with it. Worldview has very much to do with it. And if you truly, truly cared, you'd probably be happier with somebody who was just, a hoodoo man or a conjure doctor, but knew kind of the broad strokes of voodoo, than you would somebody who had never even heard of voodoo outside of like zombie horror movies or something. But that's just if you consider the actual nature of a character to be more important than the demographic information, which is the question. Do you care more about the demographic, or do you care more about the person's nature and their worldview? Food for thought is all I'm saying. Moving on.
Similarly, a graphic novel centered around Nubia led to my telling my 10-year-old daughter about the about the Orisha gods of West African Yoruba cultures who appear in the heroine's recent stories. She had already encountered Greek and Norse gods, but this was her first time hearing about deities connected to her heritage. Okay.
Okay, well then you get points for at least knowing enough about that stuff. Well done. But again, my question is, if that stuff is important to you, then would you be upset if the writer was, say, an anthropologist who specialized in the African diaspora religions but happened to be white? Or would you be grateful that you got someone in there who understood your traditions well enough to write about them? That's the question. You're making it sound like the traditions and the race are one and the same thing, and they are definitely not the same thing. There are plenty of black people who, if you told them about the Orishas or the Loa or any of the other figures within African diaspora religions, they would look at you like you had sprouted a second head. And there are also plenty of white and or Hispanic and or mixed race people who would know quite well what you were talking about because they have similar traditions. Like, for example, and I'm not saying they're the same, but a hoodoo man would probably know a bit more about the Loa or the figures of the Orishas than a, black gangbanger would, for example. Um, a Hispanic person who practices Santeria would at least have a good idea of the ritual structure you were talking about if you started talking to them about contacting ancestors and using like graveyard dart and spell work and shit. And all of these traditions probably would have some idea of what you were talking about if you started talking to them about root work. But the race is not the important bit. The knowledge and worldview is the important bit. Moving on.
Okay. Miles Morales, a black Latino Spider-Man, and Shuri, the breakout character from the Black Panther movie, both offer new shades of dimensionality. She's a princess who cares more about her high-tech vibranium lab than fancy dresses. He's an everyman superhero equipped in new Neuroican Spanglish.
Why would you be proud of somebody who speaks in Spanglish? That's somebody who's stuck between two languages. I don't understand why you would be proud of someone speaking in Spanglish. Generally, when someone uses the term Spanglish, they mean it as an insult. They mean it to say that this character is being overly stereotypical.
Right.
I don't.
Plus, he's not that interesting of a character in the comics. Like in other media, he's actually really cool because there really isn't much there, so people kind of have to build up this character.
Yeah.
And my favorite interpretation, and Dalton, feel free to add anything to this, is the Into the Spider-Verse one.
Oh, hell yes. That movie was awesome and deserved to basically spawn its own franchise.
Kind of has, I think.
I hope that Spider-Man No Way Home lives up to the hype of Into the Spider-Verse.
It won't.
I can dream, goddamn you.
The Marvel Spider-Man movies make me dead inside.
I know.
Anyway, but there are still more superhero stories to be told. Okay, for the record, they aren't really superheroes. Well, Miles is. Shuri is more of a side character.
Well, I mean, she was Black Panther for a while in the comics, and they're probably going to make her Black Panther in the movies before too long, especially with Chadwick Boseman, may he rest in peace, passing on.
Yeah. I don't really care anyway, but just because like it has been properly built up or anything, so that's the thing. Yeah, but there are still more superhero stories to be told. I would love to see the black characters Icon and Rocket soar on screens because their mentor/sidekick relationship runs off a delicious intergenerational and socioeconomic class conflict. Really, that's all. Not because like they're super cool characters and their dynamic is kind of like just kind of friends, honestly.
Yeah, and not because they contrast worldviews or anything. What with Icon being a Republican, the last I checked.
Also, just because, because actually I pulled up his kind of I mean I'm not gonna do the big long history. I'm just gonna do a quick summary of it. Just because character, and you and I have talked a lot about this. Like these characters, like the milestone characters, really should be given their due in the spotlight because they're really cool.
Yeah, and because an entire generation grew up on the Static cartoon and still love that character to death.
Yeah. All right.
Yo.
Yo. Yeah. Hello. Arnis of Terminus is a marooned alien negotiator. After crashing in the Deep South in 1839, he worked himself up from slave to Union soldier to lawyer and was involved in much of Black history. He developed the persona of Augustus Freeman, posing as his own son 4 times. When he met young Raquel, she convinced him to become a superhero, an icon for the Black community of Dakota City. Oh, and there's a quote before they give the introduction, right?
Mm-hmm.
I am old by your standards, old enough to know that justice is either for everyone or no one. Yeah, yeah, and like you said, like he's like a black Republican, but that's because like he grew up during like the time of the Civil War and stuff.
Yeah, before the party switch in the mid I think it was the 50s when the party switch happened.
Either way,
Assuming you believe the party switch ever did happen, there's some debate whether such a thing ever actually did
I don't
occur, but let's not open that can of worms before we have to.
I don't really care. No, but he's like, I remember someone saying like one of the creators who had mentioned this character, like a documentary on Milestone, is he decided to stay Republican because Abraham Lincoln was Republican and he he's do help free the slaves and stuff and all. So yeah, and like that's very interesting. Also on the fact that it's just a really cool character, and I think the big issue is that he never really got his time to really like shine, develop because like the series only had like 42 issues, I believe.
I think I don't remember off the top of my head.
Yeah, 42 issues. I mean that's a lot, obviously, but it's just a really, really interesting world that the Milestone universe is. Like Dakota City, I mean.
Mm-hmm.
All right, but
But the point I think Brainstormer and I were both kind of trying to make there is once again we have a situation where you care more about the implications and the meta woo and the secondary usefulness of the characters than you do the actual content of the characters. And that is the fucking problem. You see these characters like they're pieces on a freaking chessboard just waiting to be moved around to whatever you want to fucking do with them, rather than characters in their own right who should be served first and foremost. And that pisses a lot of people off because a lot of people like these characters as themselves rather than as some sort of sociocultural mouthpiece. That doesn't mean that black kids in various places didn't relate to those characters or anything, or weren't ever inspired by those characters or anything. But I think even they would say they would rather those characters be left alone to be themselves than become some sort of stump speech makers for BLM or some shit.
moving on.
Yeah.
Introduced by Milestone Media in 1993 and created by Gwen McDuffie and Mark Bright. The two characters first meet when the teenager Rocket, aka Raquel Irving, tries to burgle the mansion owned by the well-off lawyer Augustus Freeman, who is actually an alien stuck on Earth since the 19th century. Yes, Icon is a sly remix on the Superman myth, and the characters are part of the DC universe. Augustus uses powers to stop the theft, but When Raquel sees that he can fly, she pleads with him to don a cape and become a hero named Icon, a symbol for the residents of her hometown to look up to. But his old school ways clash with her youthful idealism. Augustus tells his teenage sidekick to defer to the police during their first big outing. She isn't having any of it as they fight crime in the original 1990s run-up Icon. Augustus and his protege argue with police and each other about everything from respectability politics to her own unplanned pregnancy.
Mm-hmm.
Again, nothing else that's the end of what he's talking about for Icon and Rocket, which is super weird to me.
Yeah, it's either a seeing the characters for what they can do sociopolitically again, or it's a non sequitur. And to reduce Rocket and Icon to a non sequitur is just stupid.
Yeah. Jo Mullein, the African-American heroine who starts in DC Comics' Far Sector series, comes at the question of police accountability from a very different angle. Jo's career as a police officer hits an ethical impasse after her partner uses excessive force on a job. Disillusioned, she accepts an offer to join the Green Lantern Corps, like John Stewart before her. Once she's stationed in a cosmic metropolis teeming with its own unique political tensions, she questions whether she, having witnessed firsthand how cops can reinforce structural inequalities, should uphold the unjust extraterrestrial law of the land. That actually does sound pretty interesting. Not gonna lie.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really have anything to say to that because I don't really know this character, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
Warner Brothers recently announced that a new Green Lantern TV show is in development. Ideally, it will be built around Jo, please no, short for Sojourner, a pivotal figure in Black history. God. Okay. There are myriad juicy storytelling possibilities with a character who is a Black woman and a cop, especially in light of current tensions around policing in the United States. God. So that's all that matters then, huh?
Again, it's just let's use this character as a means to the end of talking about the socio-political woo. And I'm sure her character and personality will come up at some point, I guess. That appears to be the way this person is thinking. And that's what everyone is fucking sick of. You see these characters. It's okay. It's like in a SpongeBob cartoon, whenever SpongeBob comes up with an interesting idea and Mr. Krabs only sees dollar signs. That's basically what you're doing, except you see, critical race theory textbooks in your eyes instead of dollar signs. That's all you see when you look at these characters. It's like the cartoon wolf smacking its lips every time he sees a sheep or a chicken or something. You only see these characters as what they can do for you or what they can do for some grand abstract narrative. You never see them as full-fledged entities unto themselves that need to be handled with some kind of care or depth or relatability or merit of any kind. As long as they're serving the right socio-political narrative, you don't care about the rest of anything, and that's the problem. A lot of people, even the people who you claim to be playing victim on the behalf of, care about these characters because of these characters. They don't care about them as means to an end. They care about them as ends in and of themselves. Moving on.
Right. Icon, Rocket, Dr. Voodoo, and Jo Mullein are heroes, but I also want the world to meet Masquerade, who is more of an anti-hero. Masquerade, another creation of Milestone Media, debuted in Blood Syndicate, a series named for a rambunctious gang of teens who gain superhuman abilities after exposure to experimental radioactive tear gas. Ah yes, the Big Bang, where we got the Bang babies.
Yeah, huh?
I wonder if that was actually taken from the Milestone comics, or was that made for the show itself?
It was probably one of the things that was adapted. Like
I
it
mean,
probably wasn't the exact same in the comic, but it was probably adapted from it.
well, I know like in the comics they did have like there was an experimental tear gas used. I just didn't know if it was like if the event itself obviously was referred to as the Big Bang and people who got the powers from it were called Bang Babies because I thought that might have been something for the show itself.
I mean, it's probably one of those things that's a little bit of both. I'd have to actually go and look it up.
Mm, okay. Anyway. Um, okay. Before getting shape shifting powers, Masquerade lived life as a woman. But when the Blood Syndicate starts fighting mind manipulating enemies, Masquerade battles as a man. Masquerade's lowest moment happens when a demonic adversary changes him back to a woman, a gender presentation that never fit. To be fair, they were more forward thinking back then.
Yeah, and do you notice something about most of the Milestone characters? Most of them came out in the 90s, at a time when none of this critical race nonsense or diversity pushing was going on, and yet there was an entire line within DC Comics specifically for this reason. Does this perhaps contradict your narrative about this all being so very new and edgy, sir? Also, I just want to point this out because I can't believe I didn't bring this up earlier, but um Dr. Voodoo only started calling himself Dr. Voodoo after he met Doctor Strange and basically appropriated the title of Doctor from Doctor Strange. Before that, he was called Brother Voodoo. Um, and quite frankly, I find it a little bit annoying that when he became Sorcerer Supreme, he took the title of Doctor, because no other Sorcerer Supreme previously had just taken the title of Doctor. Doctor Strange is called Doctor Strange because he actually has a goddamn medical degree. Um, and while that's not really relevant to his exploits as a sorcerer, he's still earned the position. And I guess you could make the argument that much in the same way as Dr. Fate is called Doctor because he's a doctor of the mystic arts, Brother Voodoo could say the same thing. But given how hard you guys are on the concept of cultural appropriation and how proud you ostensibly are of the fact that Brother Voodoo is a Hungan of Haiti, why would you want him to appropriate the title of Doctor from Doctor Strange? Why wouldn't you want him to stay Brother Voodoo so as to um maintain the separateness of his own identity rather than appropriating or succumbing to someone else's? Just saying. I mean, if you genuinely do want individual black identities to be worthwhile, then maybe don't take the title of doctor from a white guy just because you like the way it worked aesthetically for you.
Right.
Food for thought. And moving on.
Mm-hmm. The scene is witnessed by a character named Fade. Masquerade confronts Fade, closeted gay man who is intangible and unstuck in time. In one of the series' most charged sequences, Masquerade threatens to out Fade if he reveals what he saw. Confrontation is an astringent, groundbreaking flashpoint for LGBTQ representation in superhero comics. Okay, and it just sounds very interesting. Like I kind of wish I could read the comic myself just to gauge, because I think he's just obviously like he's not really the whole story.
Yeah, he's telling a very biased version of it, which hyper focuses on the identity stuff,
So,
which might also be part of the problem.
yeah, but no, it sounds interesting to be fair. But yeah, yeah, the Milestone. If I remember correctly, Milestone Media was one for trying to push. Yeah, it was trying to push boundaries back then.
Yeah, just like Vertigo and just like Image at the time.
I would say Milestone probably did it best, along with Vertigo. Like Vertigo was first, Milestone was like second, and Image was like the
Yeah,
third.
it took a while for Image to kind of find its footing,
Yeah.
so they were kind of late to the party. But
Um, Masquerade comes across as unsympathetic in the scene, but the comics writer Danny Lore sees it differently. Cool name, by the way, for the writer.
mhm.
It's very interesting that this is between a trans man and a gay man. Lore told me it is a situation in which the perspective and understanding of what a possible community would look like is still so different. Fate is lacking the understanding of the harm that still looms within the queer community for a trans man, and Masquerade is missing out what that support could do. And they both have legitimate reasons for feeling that way. Okay, yeah, no, that's logical. That makes sense.
Mhm.
And plus,
I
like,
wish I wish we didn't have to hyper focus on that one aspect of it, but
well,
okay.
I think that's what the scene is anyway. Even if you don't hyper focus on it.
Mhm.
But
But
no,
I'd be more interested in the like connections between those two characters
yeah,
either before or after this, because this seems like the kind of thing that would be a good basis for a friendship that I the person writing this article isn't addressing the outcome of it because it doesn't seem like he actually cares about the outcome of it. Just that
mhm,
this, if you look at it right, can be this, this story about a trans person and a gay person teaming up.
mhm. The moving forward.
Yep.
Yeah. The vast majority of superheroes are cisgender, and the stories told for mainstream audiences by Hollywood. Masquerade could be a trailblazer, someone who demonstrates the power and peril of daring to define their own identity. I mean, to be fair, defining your own destiny is kind of a thing with superheroes in terms of superhero identity.
Yeah, because there's always going to be this dichotomy between predestination and free will amongst the superhero genre, especially when you've got characters who are chosen or found worthy in order to wield their powers. There's always going to be this notion of what do my abilities and what does my being chosen um what responsibilities does that convey upon me? Or, how can I find my individual way? And given that many of the superheroes in every universe have a secret identity, I would go so far as to say defining yourself and defining who you are and figuring out who you are and your personality and your identity is kind of a common thread that goes through all of superhero storytelling.
Yeah,
It's literally about the prospect of taking personal power and what you are obligated or not to do with that. So my question is, why are again why can't you see those elements in every other superhero story that they occur in? Why do you need this specific subvariant within a subvariant within a subvariant of this in order to make this work? Or do you genuinely lack the ability to relate to any character who isn't a minority status of some kind or other?
it's weird. Like one of my favorite characters. Actually, you know what? I'll hold off on that just if it comes up. I mean,
Okay.
Um, many of the most famous superhero characters belong to the catalogs of DC or Marvel, major publishers with pipelines that feed directly into film and TV stories. That's because they've been around a lot longer.
And they've been more successful, and their universes are vast and complicated and intricate.
Hmm.
So there's a lot to pull from.
Yeah, but there's also a vibrant landscape driven by smaller publishers and independent creators, filled with fictional personas who can take readers into new horizons. See, I don't disagree with that, and like I think you and I have been kind of saying like there should be more like independent adaptations of like independent stories, independent comics and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But again, like I think with the context of this article, I don't know if I should agree with that.
Yeah, and again, to put a finer point on that, what do you mean by new horizons? Do you mean new ideal horizons, like new ideas, new perspectives, or do you mean new sub-facets and subcategories of identity? Because they're not the same thing. You can have a room full of one kind of people. You could have a room full of nothing but black men, but they each could have their own individual perspective. And likewise with white men, or white women, or black women, or, mixed race people of all different kinds, or entirely composed of trans women, but they all could have different perspectives. Because demographic and identity are not indicators of personality um or self-identity, the individual perspective.
Right. Um, Titles like Isan Senna Na, The Were Spider, Spirit's Destiny, Ianu, Child of Wonder, and Harriet Tubman, Demon Slayer, tell tales of immigrant demigods, toy with history, and zero in on the moments when fated duty and individual desire pull a person in opposite directions. Okay, those sound cool, but I'm worried in the context of this article.
Yeah, and again, it's very little, if nothing, to do with their identities and more to do with the world building and the characters themselves. And again, the theme of destiny or obligation versus free will and sort of abstinence is a very common thread among all superheroes. It's kind of the duality of themes you see in every single superhero story. Do do I do with my self and my individual power what I would want to do, or do I do what I am called to do? And where is the line between those, and when is each case justified? Like you look at a character like Spider-Man, and he is pretty much the quintessential I must do what I am called to do. I must reach for something higher. With great power comes great responsibility. Now you compare that to somebody like John Constantine, whose whole existence essentially is I'm a spit in the eye of destiny because you all are morons, and bollocks to all of you. And in both cases, because of the aspects of their own individual worlds that they deal with, both of those themes are justified because there is an aspect of free will that can lead to hedonism and self-destructiveness, which is why we have characters like Spider-Man and why people can relate to the idea of power relating to obligation. But there is also an aspect where destiny and fate can become deterministic to the point of being fatalistic, i.e., we're doomed to serve this one role and only this one role. So it makes sense to have a character like John Constantine, whose whole premise is essentially bollocks to all of you, I'm going to do my own thing because I can. It's the juxtaposition of duty and defiance, and where the threshold between those can be drawn, and when each is justified. Moving on.
Yeah. Seated at the center of the most popular black superhero concept in the world, King T'Challa is royalty in more ways than one. Eh, eh. But most black folk don't live lives of palace privilege. Why not explore other characters?
They have. They've been doing it for decades. The first major success within the comic book movie genre of the previous decade or so was Blade. And Blade is very, very, very black. So, yeah. And even before that, you had Spawn, which, while it wasn't a particularly great movie, it certainly tried. Moving on. Unless you had something to say. Unless he left again. I think he left again. Unless I dipped out because StreamYard is being dumb. Which is also possible.
I'm back. Sorry.
Okay.
Dog.
Yep.
Dog.
Yeah, I had to deal with the cat while you were away, too. So, yeah. Animals being uppity bitches tonight.
Yep. I guess now would be a good time to bring up like Spawn, who's like one of my favorite comic book characters. Granted, he's not really, like he's one of the first superheroes, well, anti-heroes that I can remember. And you know, he is he is a very different comparable to my actual favorite hero, well, superhero is, which is Superman. You know, but yeah, and like you know, I'm like I said, I'm like Latino, plus a lot of other things. Or as Dalton so passionately calls me from time to time, a mutt.
Yep.
But like one of my favorite superheroes is Spawn, on the fact that he's a very tragic story man trying to do good, even though like his soul is literally damned. He's and yeah, he is black, but I mean to be fair, like most of the story, he literally has his skin entirely burned off, so you can't tell.
Yeah.
Also, he's just badass and like just.
Yeah. And in relation to what I was just saying a little bit ago about Constantine, Spawn is yet another character whose whole shtick is kind of throwing defiance in the eyes of both heaven, hell, and everywhere in between when he can.
Yeah.
Like at one point, he literally declares war on both heaven and hell.
Right, but the thing is, like, their race never really became a factor. Honestly, it was more their, yeah,
nor should it have.
Yeah, it was more their personality and their stories overall that kind of, I would say, drew us to them, respectively.
Yeah.
Shall we move on?
Yeah.
Right. A conflicted cosmic cop, a generation gap, or generational gap, a superhero or a shapeshifting antihero who runs wild in the streets has the potential to become the next breakouts. At the core of every superhero sits an existential question. How do we imagine ourselves into being? With every new black superhero that audiences encounter, they can see that the answers are as varied as we are. See, I don't disagree with that, but
the thing is, it's the same way with every new superhero. You seriously can't tell me that Captain America is the same as Doctor Strange, who is also not the same as Tony Stark, who is also not the same as Charles Xavier, who is also not the same as Wolverine, who is also not the same as Scott Summers, who is also not the same as Jean Grey, and on and on and on we go. Because demographic information is not indicative of world building, personality, or character. That requires more depth and complexity to do properly. And hell, every character, almost to a fault, in the Milestone universe is black, and yet every single individual story within the Milestone comics are different. A story written by Ta-Nehisi Coates is going to be vastly different from a story written by Christopher Priest, and it's going to be vastly different further from anything written by Dwayne McDuffie, and on we go. Because despite what you may have been told in academia, there is no black experience, there is no black perspective. There are perspectives of people who happen to be black, and sometimes there might be some impact there, but there is no racial or demographic oversoul in any of these cases. Somebody like Milo Yiannopoulos or Caitlyn Jenner is very different from somebody like ContraPoints or Blair White, or I could go on. No demographic information guarantees a single perspective. There may be some impact between them. Like, I probably wouldn't be the same person if I didn't have to deal with some of the struggles that my disability has put me through in my life, or, being bisexual but mostly preferring guys has put me through in my life, or being an obstinate motherfucker who doesn't know how to take no for an answer and therefore goes and explores obscure philosophy for, basically a living. But all of these things are mostly incidental to the person I am. And I wouldn't consider any one of them to be the center spoke of my personality, because I'm a complex person who has complex shit going on in his life. Just like every other person on the fucking face of the earth, and just like every decently well-rounded and well-written character. Okay, moving on. Was that seriously the end of that guy's article? That guy didn't really conclude any of his points.
To be fair, I don't really think he had one.
But like, even if the person likes hearing themselves talk and repeats themselves over and over, there's at least a central thesis. But in all honesty, it kind of feels like Eve Ewing's article was just a little bit too short, so they tacked on the other guy's article just to like pad the length, almost.
Yeah. Okay, so moving on.
Mm-hmm.
This will be your cup of tea, Dalton.
Oh Lord, this Pandora's box of things.
Yeah. Your bitter salty tea. That's where I was going with it. Okay, so this is from the Insider.com. Doctor Strange scene was cut from the WandaVision finale, so a white guy wouldn't save the day. This is written by Jacob Sarkeesian. This is published May 4th, 2021.
This might be me being a slight bit paranoid, but if he's any relation to Anita, this is going to be a disaster.
It's a pretty short article, actually, all things considered. So,
mercifully,
yeah. Okay, when Paul Bettany teased a massive surprise cameo from someone, what happened in the WandaVision finale, many fans speculated that it would be Benedict Cumberbatch's Doctor Strange. appearing Wanda's Westview. Like so many other fan theories of the show, this never materialized, with Bettany ending up being the cameo maker himself all along. But it turns out that there were actually plans for the Master of the Mystic Arts to be involved in the finale after all.
Yes, because and for the record, even before that Paul Bettany interview, people were speculating that Doctor Strange would appear in WandaVision because WandaVision was supposed to tie directly into Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, and it kind of made sense for Doctor Strange to come in at the end and be like, "Here, Wanda, let me help you with this," because that's sort of what Doctor Strange is there for.
Well, also, like, I know, like, he's a surgeon and all, but as a doctor, it is kind of part of his job to care for essentially a mentally ill patient.
Yeah,
Would be.
and therein lies the see my problem with this whole so the white guy wouldn't save the day thing is twofold. Thing number one, playing within the producer's sandbox for a little bit, because they kept saying this is a story about trauma, this is a story about trauma, this is a story about trauma. Okay, fine. That does not excuse keeping Doctor Strange out of it, because I've seen arguments where people say things like, we couldn't have had Doctor Strange come in because this needed to be a story about Wanda's trauma and her own ability to deal with it. But the problem with that is, if this was supposed to really be a story primarily focused on trauma, I don't know if you guys have ever gone through trauma, but generally, when dealing with things like trauma, being able to rely on friends, particularly people with professional backgrounds like Doctor Strange, is useful for coping strategies. That's why there's things like therapy. And incidentally, it would have made perfect sense for Doctor Strange to come in and essentially be the person Wanda could, the shoulder Wanda could cry on at the end, because number one, it's kind of his job. Number two, as I just established, within the case of the trauma theming, it makes sense that networking and socializing and being able to rely on a support group is a necessary part of coping with trauma in a lot of cases. And number three, for purely in-universe reasons, if there was ever anyone qualified to deal with magic-based trauma, it would be the former brain surgeon who is also a master of the mystic arts. That's kind of directly what he's for. And incidentally, Doctor Strange has already um done things like this in other stories. For example, there was a comic book storyline called Spider-Man Fever, where um Spider-Man gets possessed by a spider deity, and Doctor Strange basically has to come in and be an exorcist, which ultimately ends up having to have him deal with some of Peter's psychological issues, which made him vulnerable to the demon to begin with. And speaking of Spider-Man references, in the Spider-Man animated series show from the 90s, in his debut episode, Doctor Strange helps Mary Jane break free of the psychological hold that Baron Mordo has over her by falsely reconnecting her with an image of her father, and Doctor Strange comes in and forces her to cope with the actual repressed memories of her father. At which point, Mary Jane is able to stand up to freaking Dormammu. So don't tell me there isn't precedent for this. And even in Doctor Strange Sorcerer Supreme, which was the animated movie from 2007, a large part of that movie was premised on him being able to visit children in magical comas in their dreams and saving them from Dormammu, who was trying to use their minds as a gateway to enter the mortal world. So yeah, this is very much up Doctor Strange's alley. It would have fit well with the trauma theming, and reducing a former doctor and master sorcerer to just the white guy is one of the most fucking stupid things I think I've ever heard in my life. Just so we're clear.
Moving forward.
Moving on, yeah.
In an interview for the May 2021 print edition of Rolling Stone, Marvel Studios boss Kevin Feige confirmed that Cumberbatch was scheduled to pop up as Sorcerer Supreme in the show's closing episode, but that those plans were changed for a very specific reason. Feige told Rolling Stone some people might say, "Oh, it would have been so cool to see Doctor Strange, but it would have taken away from Wanda." If it's done right, it wouldn't have.
Yeah, no, it would not have. And again, if I play this game of yours, this game where everything has to have a meta significance, and in this case, it has to all relate to trauma, again, if you knew anything about how people deal with trauma, having support groups, in particular in professional ways, a la therapy, is a component of how people deal with trauma. It's why things like Alcoholics Anonymous and Sexual Assault Victims Anonymous exist, because people find it easier to cope with trauma if they have a reliable support group, especially a decently informed one, like, say, oh, I don't know, a doctor who also specializes in magic, which is the result of Wanda's trauma. Yeah, I do not like this. We couldn't have had Doctor Strange come in because it would have taken away from Wanda. No, all it would have done, if you did it right, writers, would have been to show the necessary part that companionship and professional help plays in dealing with trauma. In fact, if we really want to play this card where it lies for a second, what you've implied by not letting someone like Doctor Strange come in and help Wanda through her magic-inducing trauma is that people dealing with trauma should isolate themselves from people qualified to help them. And I don't believe that art needs to have a meta woo, but if you do and you insist on this story in particular being focused on trauma, what you have just implied by your own logic is it's better for victims of trauma to isolate themselves and become pathological than it is for them to seek a friend group for support or a professional counselor for support. And that is fundamentally wrong if that is indeed where you want to go with that. And fuck you.
Mm-hmm. Also, from a writing perspective, I think was it the episode before the finale where Agatha is going through Wanda's mind, or was it the last episode?
No, it was episode 7. So yeah, the episode before the end, or yeah, episode 8, the episode before the finale, was the flashback episode.
Okay, well, I think from a writing perspective, it would have been really interesting if you did a parallel where Strange is trying to help Wanda by going through basically the same, where Doctor Strange is going through the same memories that Agatha had done, and just trying,
But actually doing so to help her.
yeah,
And then it would have had an interesting parallel between Strange and Agatha, where Agatha could have been the devil on her shoulder and Strange could have been the angel on her shoulder. And it could have commented on the difference between toxic relationships or enablers and actual constructive interventions and professional help. Which, if you were at all interested in playing this meta woo trauma card of yours, you probably should have thought of that. because there is such a thing as enablers of victims of trauma, the kind of people who want the kind of people who either advertently or inadvertently get the person to hyper focus on their trauma instead of actually dealing with it and moving forward. Which is exactly what Agatha did, because when Wanda tried to free the people of Westview, and Vision and the kids started disappearing, it was Agatha's prodding that convinced Wanda to put the barrier back up, which could have been, if you really, really want to play this meta card that I don't think we should play, but nevertheless, if you really want to play the meta card, that could have been excellent commentary on enabling and the difference between stable friendships and toxic ones. Moving forward.
Okay. Feige continued. We didn't want the end of the show to be commoditized. Go to the next movie. Here's the white guy. Let me show you how power works.
To reduce any version of Stephen Strange to simply the white guy pisses me off so deeply you have no conceivable idea. Move, cat. Move. Come on. Up. Jump. Jump up. So you're out of the side of the camera, please. Thank you.
Yeah, she's your cat. She wants the attention.
Yes. Yes, cat.
Right. You were saying, Golden?
Yeah. To reduce Stephen Strange to the white guy, implying that he's basically interchangeable with every other character in the Marvel Universe, is just the single stupidest thing I've ever heard. Again, to go through his layers of expertise, he is an expert in medicine and in magic. Therefore, a trauma victim whose trauma episodes are causing magical outbursts, he's basically the only qualified doctor to treat something like that. And given Doctor Strange's insistence in his first movie about keeping to the Hippocratic Oath even after he's not a doctor anymore, it would have been a nice fit to have him sort of acting as the soothing shoulder to cry on for Wanda, and incidentally, him teaching her to cope with her powers could have also, on a meta level, which I hate operating in, but you insisted on operating in it, could have been him teaching her how to deal with, psychological trauma and regaining things like self-control. It's the sort of thing that you deal with when you go to therapy. You don't want trauma outbursts to hurt people. You want to be able to get them back under control and to regain and restructure your life. That's the case in both dialectical behavioral therapy or DBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT, which are the two biggest kinds of therapy to deal with trauma, which you would know if you actually did care about the meta implications of this story in relation to trauma. Or you could have just told it as a really good Marvel story, in which case it still makes sense for Doctor Strange to fucking be there. So no matter how you slice this, whether it's a story about trauma that just so happens to take place in the Marvel Universe, or it's a story within the Marvel Universe that just so happens to touch on elements of trauma, nevertheless, it would have made infinitely more sense for Doctor Strange to be there, considering everything about his character basically makes him qualified to deal with this exact situation, and every and many previous uses of the character in other media also make him qualified to deal with this specific situation, because it's kind of this specific situation that he specializes in. There's a reason why the writers had Doctor Strange talking to Peter during One More Day, because it was him who was supposed to be qualified to explain to Peter that letting go of his attachments to Aunt May would be the most healthy way of dealing with his grief. And if Joe Quesada didn't have a bug up his ass about the marriage, that is how the story would have probably gone. That and Doctor Strange BTFOing the shit out of Mephisto if Doctor Strange was being written properly, but that's a different story. Like, this is the kind of thing that Doctor Strange specializes in. He is a mystic, he is a doctor, he is a healer, and he is a sorcerer. So, magically induced psychological trauma, probably exactly his cup of tea. Dumbasses. Moving on.
Okay. Feige said the fake commercial breaks that were shown in each WandaVision episode would have been Wanda sending messages to Doctor Strange as he attempted to break through her sitcom fabrication. Slash Film also wrote that Marvel had even finalized a deal with Cumberbatch to appear in the season's final episode. However, this was changed in a late rewrite to keep focus on Wanda and, to a lesser extent, Catherine Hahn's Agatha.
Okay, and again, we just went over how that could have been resolved as well. Have Agatha be the enabler or the toxic relationship, encouraging Wanda to wallow in her delusions, like she did in the freaking episode, by the way, and have Strange be the educated professional, both mystically and psychologically, trying to get her to cope in a constructive way. They basically did a storyline similar to this, again, like I was saying, back in the 90s Spider-Man cartoon, where Baron Mordo used glamour and persuasion magic to enthrall various people using broken emotional connections they had with their loved ones to enslave them. And then Doctor Strange came in and used his magic to dispel those enslavements by actually making the people in question deal with their trauma. Shush, cat. You're being very noisy. And even if you didn't want to go that exact same route, it nevertheless at least proves that this kind of story is the kind of story that you should be employing Doctor Strange for, and Doctor Strange is definitely qualified to deal with. Moving on. Unless he left again.
I'm back. Sorry.
No problem.
In the final version of the show, the finale saw Wanda begin to master her own powers as the Scarlet Witch without much explaining from anyone, although Agatha did serve to explain a bit about her powers rather than teach her how to use them. Wanda did inadvertently learn a couple of things from Agatha too, but that was through her own actions.
And incidentally, if you don't bring Agatha back to be her magical mentor at some point, I'm going to be extremely annoyed with you, because that was the role she served in the comics. That was the role she was kind of serving in the series. And Agatha's final words to Wanda before she was trapped within a delusion of Wanda's making was, "You will need me someday." And Wanda's response was, "I'll at least know where to find you," which implies that at some point she's going to go and find her again. Plus, if we're doing Fantastic Four in the end of this phase, that means someday we're going to need Franklin Richards to exist, and in the comics, Agatha was Franklin's nanny. And I want more Mary Poppins jokes, because she's a witch and she would be his nanny. So, yes.
Right, okay. The show ended with Wanda, now officially the Scarlet Witch, and in possession of the Darkhold, seemingly teaching herself some pretty serious magic. Some fans were left disappointed by the absence of Strange as well as other fan favorite theories that were proven wrong, such as the presence of Mephisto. Many were expecting a more dramatic end to the show with more twists and reveals. Don?
Yeah, yes, because here's the thing. You set up the show as a slow burn. And the thing about slow burns is slow burns are the most satisfying when they have large payoffs, i.e., you make people wait for the developments and you take your time making the developments, but then you counterbalance that by having a large payoff. What you could have done is kept things moving at a relative pace, but then had relatively small payoffs. But you cannot have it both ways. You can't do a slow burn and then only have minor payoffs, because then you're left with the audience feeling cheated. Especially if the slow burn nature of your story also happens to include quite a few major red herrings, which yours did, which then not only amount to nothing, but actively spit in the eye of the invested fan base. Cough, cough, Evan Peters, Ralph Boner, cough. And actively insult the investment that the audience had in the story. If you're there's this principle in writing called a Chekhov's gun, which basically is essentially, if you're not going to make use of a plot element, then do not draw attention to said plot element. And Evan Peters is the very essence of a Chekhov's gun. If you weren't going to make something out of Evan Peters, why in all Hallows' ass did you include him? And if you were just going to include him as a sidebar or a reference, why on earth did you make him central to several episodes, therefore implying a larger role than you were intending to give him? And milking the fan base for their investment and then basically insulting them for getting invested. That is basically what you did. You set up a situation where the fan base was likely to get invested, and then rather than have that investment lead to anything of substance, you shat on the intelligence of your fan base and the passion they devoted to this series, and in the process pissed off a lot of them, because you set up a slow burn with no large payoffs. You set up a Chekhov's gun that you had no intention of doing anything with, and rather than even just leave that element alone, you actively undermined the investment that your fan base had in that plot thread. You basically did everything wrong, and rather than take your lumps and take responsibility for your own creative decisions, you belittle and manipulate the audience instead. Dumbasses.
Alright, okay, but while Wanda and Doctor Strange didn't get to appear together in WandaVision, the two will team up in the upcoming Doctor Strange sequel, Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, scheduled to be released on March 25th, 2022. The movie will focus on Strange and will heavily feature Wanda, although in what capacity, hero or villain, we're not quite sure yet. And what we do know is that Elizabeth Olsen shot both WandaVision and In the Multiverse of Madness back to back, so there will clearly be some overlap between the two mystical properties.
Well, given that Wanda has the freaking Darkhold, she probably is going to at least be an anti-hero, because Darkhold is basically the source of all dark magic within the Marvel Universe in the comics. Not to mention, it's one of the books that was missing from the Ancient Ones collection in Doctor Strange 2016. The other one presumably being the Book of the Vishanti, which would explain why Doctor Strange has no verbal spell components yet in the MCU, and also why he's not the Sorcerer Supreme yet. And if you contradict me on that, I'm going to fight you, because Doctor Strange has only so far said that he is a Master of the Mystic Arts, which is a title that the Ancient One gave to him at the end of Doctor Strange 2016. He has not yet indicated that he is the Sorcerer Supreme, and the powers that he has put on display so far do not indicate that he is the Sorcerer Supreme, just a very intelligent master of the mystic arts, which we knew already. Moving on.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this was something Don sent me like last week to do this week.
Mhm.
I don't know if this was you sent this to me personally. Like you sent this to me because of the title.
I just saw it and I knew there would be plenty to work with in it. So
Right. Okay. So this from Screen Rant. Been a while since we covered them. Yeah, like I said, this was published April 29th, 2021. Batman Superman highlights everything wrong with superheroes. I'll be honest, I read this just to see if this was like kind of like a clickbait article. It's got some stuff worth talking about. And to be fair, folks, we have not read the comic itself when we're going off the article. It's its own thing.
I'm judging Screen Rant based on what Screen Rant writes, not the actual book itself.
Okay. Batman Superman highlights everything wrong with superheroes. Who would have thought that characters that are over 80 years old have outdated moralistic tendencies? Writer Gene Luen Yang dissects the conundrum. This is by Andrew Firestone.
I'm going to be very, very surprised if he ends up successfully defending the term outdated.
I doubt it.
And incidentally, you really don't want to open up the can of worms of judging characters for being overly moralistic. Otherwise, everything written with a social justice bent is fair game, because social justice elements in modern comics are just as forced as family values and evangelical traditionalism were in the previous generation.
Right.
So you probably don't want to start your argument by allowing me to judge you based on how moralistic you're being, because you may not like the results.
Right, like I said, when Dalton sent this to me, I read it a little bit. I haven't finished the whole thing, but yeah, no, it is worth talking about. To be fair.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Let's dig in.
Warning: spoilers ahead for Batman Superman number 17. I didn't even know this was a comic. To be fair, so
yeah, I wasn't aware this was being published. Although I find the claim that it's everything wrong with comics to be a bit. Yeah. To be a bit.
Yeah, everything wrong with superheroes. Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Meta commentary seems to be the name of the game. In Gene Luen Yang and Evan Reese's newly minted run on Batman Superman, namely isolating exactly what is wrong with the superhero genre.
What is wrong with the superhero genre is that exact perspective, quite frankly. The need to meta everything.
I'm not really sure if I can comment because I kind of do that with some of the stories I write. Kind of, I guess.
Usually when you do it though, it's sort of meta-ing the meta. Like you take other people's meta woo and sort of reground it into its original format. It's almost like a rebuttal sometimes.
Man, I'm just trying to write, if anything.
Yeah. It's almost like the goal of all writers should be to write good stories, but what the fuck do we know, I guess?
Okay. A world-bending story arc, The Archive of Worlds, is set within 3 separate realities, with Batman Superman number 17 fittingly entitled Worlds Collide. That's certainly a creative name. It's a creative title. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I mean sarcastic, of course. It's just
Yeah.
Writer Yang is currently exploring the ethos behind the Cape Crusader and the Man of Tomorrow through a twisted Golden Age homage, revealed to be the machinations of the cinephilic robotic villain Arthur Yo.
Hmm.
New villain.
Okay.
Complex yet perceptive. Sorry. Complex yet perceptive, Yang's take on the DC mythos ends up presenting a scathing critique of superherodom. Can we get that
And
goddamn day?
hmm?
We get that every goddamn day and everything else. Seriously,
Yeah.
like it's not
And
new, it's groundbreaking, it's just the norm now. You know, be
yeah.
ground. Sorry.
And again, this is what I was saying earlier when I said that's exactly the problem. Everything needs some sort of secondary meta woo attached to it. It can never, ever just be what it is diegetically. It can never just be the content of the actual story itself. It has to have some sort of grand quasi-philosophical or socio-political significance. That is the problem with modern day superhero stories, in the sense that they're not superhero stories. They're pastiches within pastiches of superhero.
Oh, shit. They'll be back.
Okay, where did I cut off because StreamYard was being a twit?
Pastiches of pastiches.
Yeah, this need to find value not within the story itself and not within the characters themselves, but within the implications and the meta implications and the non-diegetic stuff. That is the problem. This need to this need to view everything as a means to an end rather than an end in itself. Moving on.
Mm-hmm. Okay. That's the dawn of superheroes in 1938. I mean, you can make arguments when actual.
Yeah, the pulps, and of course there were actual superhero characters before Superman, but we've
The,
all just collectively agreed that 1938. So,
well,
meh.
the more quote unquote traditional kind of superhero, thus like with the cape and tights and stuff. Yeah,
Mhm.
1938. There's wiggle room there, but that's for a different topic of discussion later at some other
Yeah.
point. Okay, since Dawn of Superheroes in 1938 with Action Comics #1, caped crime fighters have gone in and out of style as the times have changed. Yes and no, I suppose. I can't exactly disagree or agree.
I think most of the times they've gone quote unquote out of style have been because of some external influence on them rather than because of their own, like,
Merit.
yeah, they don't tend to go out of style because because they don't have any more stories to tell in that style. It's because some other influence occurs. Like in the Golden Age case, it was Frederick Wortham being a moralistic fuckwit and insinuating that comics were turning people into insane criminals or something, which
Mm.
was his which was literally his argument in The Seduction of the Innocent, So Don't At Me, or which eventually, of course, led to the Comics Code Authority, which did nerf story potential, basically. Um, or it was the result of the speculator boom in the 90s, or the 80s and the 90s, which almost single-handedly killed comics were it not for the British invasion and Marvel selling off the cinematic rights to most of its major characters.
Mm. Um, Originally action oriented, novelties geared towards children as a colorful alternative to dime store novels. Superheroes led by the iconic Batman and Superman have changed to suit their culture, morphing through the campiness of the 60s and 70s to the more grim 80s to the bombastic 90s.
Okay, but backing up, because you got something wrong in your summation there. Comics were not originally for children, they were originally for everyone because they were made using cheap paper. They were particularly popular, actually, among working class people of all backgrounds, both children and adults, because they could afford them as a kind of entertainment, and they became extremely popular with GIs of all people during times of war. Actually, they were actually sent over in care packages to soldiers in the middle of the front lines of World War II. So yeah, you can take your comics are for kids straw man, a straw man largely created by people like Frederick Wertham, and you can shove it up your ass. Moving on.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Nevertheless, one aspect of the stories told of these heroes has remained the same. Their sterling moralism of these worlds where good always prevails.
Um,
Oh God.
I don't think you know much about comics at all. No, no.
Okay, let me finish reading the last sentence here. As commentary, Yang is presenting superheroes as what they have become, the product of a bygone era that is too obsessed with safe, in air quotes, morality to tell piercing, hard-hitting stories. Motherfucker, have you read any comics?
Like I feel a little bit like Bugs Bunny right at the moment. It's like he doesn't know me very well, do he? Well, he doesn't know comics very well, do he? Sort of is my only sane response to that. You do know that for most of the Golden Age, there was a hell, if you'll pardon the pun, of influence of the superhero genre by the supernatural horror genre. Characters like the Shadow, who is basically a darker, more morally ambiguous version of Batman. Characters like Solomon Kane, who was basically a Puritan demon hunting superhero. Even, I guess you could say loosely, characters like Elrico Melvene, who was literally a, albino, decrepit sorcerer, and the ruler of his own, like, country of evil sorcerers, and also an adventurer for hire. Like, and it baffles me. It baffles me that people still make these fucking arguments.
How do
You
you?
guys do know that the comics are pure and innocent and for kids bullshit was a fucking argument that was made first by Frederick Wertham in the hopes that he would be able to control comics, and then by the Comics Code Authority, which was made to basically get Frederick Wertham and his ilk off everyone's backs so that they could make shit. And that basically boils down to people outside the comic book industry coming into the comic book industry, finding it wanting, breaking it, and then bitching that it's broken. It's just rage.
Yeah. Anyway, Batman, Superman, number 17, the mainstream again in air quotes. Bats and Supes encounter the sinister Arturo on board a hijacked satellite, revealing him to be a film-obsessed neurotic who demands drama, awe, and fear from his action tales of woe. Okay.
What does that have to do with anything?
The story then shifts to an alternate world called the World of the Dark Knight, in which a dimension displaced Superman and Lois Lane team up with Batman and Robin to get to the bottom of what has gone wrong in their respective timelines. not knowing that both are a product of Artur's obsession with fiction. Okay, this sounds interesting, but I'm scared of where it's going.
Yeah, it sounds kind of like Arturo is a spin on Control Freak almost from the Teen Titans.
I remember Control Freak. Um, both of these worlds, as presented in Batman and Superman #16, play heavily on the traditional Golden Age motifs of the characters, presenting Batman as a stalwart detective and Superman as a flawless Boy Scout. Again, he wasn't.
You you really don't know much about Golden Age comics.
He was kind of a bruiser, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, the sort of kid-friendly, child-safe versions of them are way more belonging to the Silver Age than the
Golden Age.
Golden Age. In fact, one of Superman's first appearances involves him literally walking across power lines with a guy to basically spook the shit out of him.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
Also, Batman was literally just kind of a rip-off of the Shadow, to be fair.
Yeah, and for a while, Batman even used guns before somebody had the brilliant idea of making a key point of his character motivation not doing that.
I think
So
the stalwart detective thing makes sense for Batman, honestly. Like in a Golden Age sense.
right, but have you seen like noir stories or pulp detective stories, the kind of stories that Batman was kind of a takeoff of?
Mm-hmm.
Or the Shadow, which is probably his largest influence, because there ain't nothing pure and uncorruptible about the Shadow, my friend. The Shadow is a scary, scary motherfucker.
And it is these versions of the characters whom Artur Eo feels exemplify his perfect drama. Jesus Christ! I have a feeling how this villain is representative of something. If we're doing meta commentary,
Yeah, I suspect it's gonna be a straw man of Arturio is supposed to represent the fandom somehow because reasons. We have to dump on the fandom and the sincerity of the fandom.
we'll get there. We'll get there.
No.
What Yang seems to be implying. Okay, this is the author of the article's. What's the word? Fuck.
Perspective?
No.
Analysis?
No. It's like
Extrapolation?
simpler. Like I think it's a synonym of that. Interpretation of what the writer is actually doing, because it doesn't really seem like the writer, unless I can hear it from the writer himself. I'm not entirely sure if this could just be what this author is.
Yeah, it could very well just be Screen Rant being dumb, which it definitely feels like. So proceed.
What Yang seems to be implying is that from a fundamental standpoint, these heroes have become stagnant forces in the culture at large because their publisher DC Comics refuses to allow them to evolve beyond their origins. Okay, again,
Uh-huh.
that's why I think this is just the author of this article.
Yeah. Dear
I'm sorry, like I don't think this guy has read any comics at all, ever.
Certainly not in anything resembling recent history.
No.
Okay. Person who wrote this article, whose name I don't remember.
Andrew Firestone. I don't know, the motherfucker has such a badass name like that.
Yeah. Points for style and presentation. I will give you that. Mr. Firestone, which actually lets me do my little name thing with quite a bit of panache this time. Mr. Firestone, have you ever in your life read a comic? Certainly post the British invasion, which happened in the 80s and 90s. Basically, the entirety of the 80s and 90s was breaking superheroes of this one-dimensional sort of mom baseball apple pie, leave it to Beaver box that they were in at the end of not the Golden Age, which again was much more morally ambiguous than most people give it credit for, but the Silver Age of comics, which was only the way it was because external forces like Frederick Wertham and the Comics Code Authority made it so. And that was only because Frederick Wertham himself did not understand comics. You do realize that before Frederick Wertham got his grubby little hands on the comic book genre at large, superheroes regularly fought things like zombies, werewolves, vampires, and the other assortments of the living dead, right? This one-dimensional, like, Saturday morning cartoon shit that you appear to be implying that comics have always been, number one, only became that way in the Silver Age as a result of external meddling, and number two, ended rather spectacularly when the writers of comics eventually told the Comic Code Authority to go fuck itself, and then the British invasion basically cemented more or less a return to the original Golden Age status quo, but, slightly different because, it takes a while to fix a decade's worth of ruination brought on by external forces, which is why we went from the silliness of the Silver Age to, Rob Liefeld edginess for a bit, because the comic genre, the superhero genre basically had to recalibrate a little bit, readjust for the off-kilter balance that it had been in the Silver Age. But you don't know that. You don't know about stories like Watchmen or Dark Knight Returns or Demon in a Bottle in the case of Iron Man or Strange Tales Volume 2 in the case of Doctor Strange. You don't know about any of these. You don't know about One More Day. You don't know about What's So Funny About Truth, Justice, and the American Way, or All-Star Superman, or Asbar, or any of the other, or hell, Killing Joke. I could go on, and that's not even including characters like John Constantine's Hellblazer, who is basically the antithesis of everything you've just gone through there. Like, and do we even need to bring up the late editions, like things like Invincible, to this roster? Like, if you genuinely believe that comics are still, or were at one point still, Silver Age and Saturday morning cartoons and mom baseball and apple pie, you haven't paid attention to the comic book industry for at least 30 years, and probably significantly before that. The era you're referring to happened for maybe 10 years from about the end of the from about 1950 through 1970. That's about the span of time you're talking about. And even then, there were issues like Spider-Man's drug issue, which is actually the issue that kind of famously is the one that broke the Comics Code Authority. For basically as long as people have been writing comics, they've been wanting to get away from this kind of storytelling, and only been forced to deal with it when external forces like yourself misunderstand what comics are. Moving on.
Right. Even though the days of the Comics Code are long behind them, Batman and Superman both suffer due to their inherent limitations as symbols of a moral code from an era nearly a century gone. Okay, again, fuck off. And you had never read a comic book. I'm not gonna say that, but clearly you haven't read any comics that really matter to these characters. Granted, those comics are more like specials, Elseworlds, and stuff like that, but these characters go through shit and have ideals and their own codes, and like stuff just like tested constantly.
And this appears to be your fundamental misunderstanding here. You think that because Superman and Batman were made in the 1930s and 40s, that they reflect somehow the 1930s and 40s. But the difference between the writers and the storytellers of the 1930s and 40s and you, sir, is the writers of the 1930s and 40s understood the notion of creating something to be timeless, creating something to last. They didn't want to create something that was specifically a reflection of the time in which they were writing it. They wanted to write something, a lot of them, that you could still pick up today and it would still be just as meaningful. And incidentally, if you truly believe that superheroes were only ever these one-dimensional, naive moralists, may I introduce you to the wartime era of comics, both of which featured both major companies of which featured characters beating the shit out of Hitler for the lulz, basically. So yeah, this mythical era of like moral naivete that you keep alluding to basically never existed at all, and to the extent that it did exist, it was enforced on them externally by people like Frederick Wertham and the Comics Code Authority. And as soon as the Comics Code Authority was thrown in the garbage, the industry started recalibrating, and we got stories like Demon in a Bottle, in Iron Man's case.
Right. Part of me also wants to bring up Kingdom Come.
That was
I don't
pretty.
think that's like relevant in terms of discussion here.
Yeah, and it also happened quite a lot later, so I'm not sure it can be.
Right. Well, I mean, like, I'm more just trying to bring up like comics.
Iconic stories that sort of changed the game.
Yeah.
Or got away from this mold. Yeah.
Well, the big one I was thinking was Superman. Whatever happened to Truth, Justice, and the American Way?
Yeah. Epic Superman story.
Or more commonly, if you watch the animated DC movies, not the new ones, I mean like the ones that came out in the 2000s, Superman versus the Elite, where that movie directly battles the notion of should superheroes kill bad guys. And obviously Superman being the titular character, is trying to fight for the whole, no, we don't need to kill. Like there's a great speech in there, and I can't remember it off the top of my head, like at the end. But yeah, no, it's just like it's weird. Like it's also like a gripe I've always had with like when people talk about Superman, like him being like this 2-dimensional Boy Scout and stuff.
Yeah, naive.
And that's a big problem because people often, confuse naivete with optimism.
Well,
I mean, confuse optimism with naivete and wisdom with cynicism.
Yeah, there's a lot of overlap and conflation where there doesn't need to be.
Yeah,
there definitely are people who are naive optimists, but there are also people who are optimistic almost out of like principle or a sense of obligation.
Hi. I wasn't sure if I wanted to say it or not, but
I almost did the thing of like you. But I didn't.
right. Yeah, anyway, shall we continue?
Yeah.
Writers of these stories often must rely on hackneyed, formulaic plot devices, paper tiger villains, and convoluted reality elements to tell their stories simply because they cannot portray these characters in any other light than simplistic moralist traditions of the early 20th century. Okay, again, fuck off. And clearly, you do not know comics.
And many of the comics in the freaking Golden Age, even, were written by outsiders of that status quo, deliberately critiquing it where they could. Hell, okay. For fuck's sake, one of the earliest comic book characters, which admittedly is not one most people pay a lot of attention to, but because it's up my alley, I do, is the Spectre, who is literally God's vengeance made into an entity. It is literally God's vengeance wearing a human suit. And there is nothing one-dimensionally moralistic about the freaking Spectre. He was born in a mob orchestrated car wreck, depending on the origin story you go for him, and he murders the shit out of basically anyone he can get his hands on, even with the human host. And God forbid he ever be without one, because he goes fucking insane if he's without a human tether for 5 minutes. And he was created by Gardner Fox, who was also the creator of a character called Dr. Fate in 1940. So literally just 2 years after the date line that you gave us as the beginning of superhero comics.
Also,
so I don't want to hear it.
Also, Jay Garrick, the Flash, like the original Flash.
Mm-hmm.
So really, that guy made a lot of cool characters.
Yeah. Gardner Fox is one of the unsung heroes of the Golden Age of comics. He's basically Steve Ditko before Steve Ditko.
Yep. Okay. Yang depicts the world-shaping villain RTO as symbolic of this oppressive atmosphere. A director who is fixated on capturing a depiction of perfect, in air quotes, drama that his stories never move beyond the most basic plot elements, and also a villain who uses Deus Ex Machina devices to solve any and all possible problems, such as when he summons a kryptonite bracelet from his film world to stop Superman.
Okay, and you titled this article where you talk about this as "This comic is everything wrong with modern superhero comics." That's basically what you titled this.
No. Just, I believe it is highlights everything wrong with superheroes. Not comics,
Okay.
just superheroes.
Okay. So, here's my question. Do you think superheroes being rigidly one-dimensional and moralistic is a common problem among modern comics? Because not only would I disagree with you if you were to assert such a thing, but you have it completely and utterly backwards. Yes, I would agree with you that if comics were still in the same state they were in 1938, or your version of where they were in 1938, which is actually more like where they were in the fucking 50s, that would be a problem. But if you've actually opened a comic in the last, 10 or 15 years, you would know that the actual problem is very much the fucking inverse. Writers keep trying to reinvent superheroes to such a degree that we cannot have even one-off stories that are homages back to simple morality plays anymore. We've gotten to a point where the meta aspect of comics has become so much of the conversation that no other kinds of stories can be told. We're so busy constantly reinventing the characters that we never return them to anything resembling their status quo, because every successive team of writers thinks that they are the first people to think of these quote-unquote deconstructionalist ideas, when in actuality, they're only the 20th in a long string of writers to think of these deconstructionalist ideas. Every person, basically, after the original British invasion, to do a deconstructionist story is doing a derivative story, because that was very much a key feature of what the British invasion was, and they did possibly the best versions of it in a lot of cases. As an example, my favorite character in Marvel Comics is Doctor Strange. Now, in the 80s, I believe it was the 80s, it might have been the late 70s, there was a book that he shared with Cloak and Dagger called Strange Tales Volume 2. In said story, Doctor Strange was driven to break his code of ethics that he was given by the Ancient One, which he was adhering to an obsessive and almost self-destructive degree, by engaging in dark magic. Now, as a result of the fallouts of this choice, he lost a large degree of his powers and eventually lost his title of Sorcerer Supreme. And that was an extremely well done storyline. In fact, I would go so far as to say it was the last great Doctor Strange storyline. But that didn't stop the writers of Marvel from proceeding to copy that storyline over and over again, to the point that Doctor Strange spent more time breaking his own rules than he did enforcing his own rules. And it eventually led to things like the end of World War Hulk, where Strange loses the Sorcerer Supreme mantle altogether and has to acquiesce to Brother Voodoo. And that eventually led to Way of the Weird and the Last Days of Magic, where magic literally dies because Jason Aaron is a hack who couldn't think of a different story to tell other than the God Butcher storyline again. But he wasn't smart enough to think of just putting the God Butcher storyline and the Last Days of Magic storyline together and making them one big universal event. And again with Doctor Strange Damnation, and again with Mark Waid's take on Doctor Strange, and again and again and again. Every Doctor Strange storyline became Doctor Strange uncharacteristically breaks his own rules and loses his powers and has to re-earn them yet again. And same thing with characters like Captain America. Every Captain America storyline now is Captain America becomes disillusioned with America because of some MacGuffin, and then basically ends up being a counter American force within his own country for its quote unquote own good. And then you have Superman constantly being lambasted as a naive Boy Scout, to the point that you can't tell a Superman just being heroic story anymore without somebody coming up and basically mocking him, like Batman mocked him in the speech in Dark Knight Returns. To the point now, there are more deconstructions of Superman than there are actual unambiguous, unmeta Superman stories. And you can say that about just about every character because of this exact mindset. The idea that heroes being overly rigid or overly moralistic is the major problem in comic books today is not just wrong, but is the exact inverse of the truth. There is no settling in comic books today because everyone is trying to reinvent so hard they forget that they forget the basis that they're trying to reinvent to begin with. And eventually there will just be nothing left of the original substance of the character. And the industry will die by thunderous applause from people like you, Mr. Firestone. Moving on.
Okay. By the same token, how different is Arturo from an audience who believes any tragedy or act of destruction and evil can be made right or solved simply by an opposing force of good, no matter the harm.
You are describing no one. What you appear to be trying to get at, Mr. Firestone, is there are people who hold to the convictions of these heroes. Not out of some naivete, not out of traditionalism, not out of some overly blown attachment to these characters, but because these characters have worthwhile principles that should be at least occasionally referenced at the core of these characters. Basically, what you appear to be talking about is the rant I just went on. You have people explaining to you in no uncertain terms why constantly reinventing the status quo of these characters is actively harmful to the core of the characters. And then you look at that and you see that argument as traditionalistic or naive rather than simply a please stop acting as though there is no value to these characters and please stop acting as though reinventing them is inherently better than any sort of deference to the original content of these characters. That's not naive and moralistic. It's simply asking if if you can see any value to these characters, why do you constantly feel the need to change them for no reason? And if you don't see any value to these characters, why do you feel the need to take it away from people who do see value to these characters? That is the actual argument that I think you're lampooning. But it's not out of some childish naivete or overly emotional attachment. It's out of simply wanting the characters to be left the fuck alone so they can actually function as themselves rather than as a tool for some grandiose secondary meta narrative, which is the only way that modern day writers seem to be aware to use them. It's again a problem of seeing the characters as a means to an end rather than an end in themselves. And that is the fucking crux of the issue. On both sides, by the way, because I would say the same thing to people on our quote unquote side who insist everything needs to be an archetype, everything has to have socio-cultural significance, otherwise you're not doing art correctly. Fucking elitist morons.
Mm.
Moving on.
Um, this isn't just a problem with superheroes, it's a problem with simplistic moralism in general as a storytelling discipline. Okay, that is not a discipline I'm aware of as a storyteller myself at all. Yang implies, and it's one that needs to be addressed. Could it be that this writer actually just tried to write a story and this author is taking it in really
piling woo on it so that he can make it make sense in his own framework? It is very possible, in fact. But yeah, again, I don't think Mr. Firestone understands comics at all. But if you really want to talk about one-dimensional moralism, Mr. Firestone, again, I just want to point this out. What do you call every story nowadays that must have some sort of social justice theming in it? Because social justice is just as moralistically one-dimensional as the evangelical right-wing family values of the 70s, 80s, and 90s were. It's just playing for a different team. It's the same one-dimensional moralism, just playing for a different team. How about you take external morality out of it entirely and just let the characters deal with the parameters of their own goddamn universes, like in universe, in character logic, rather than making everything a means to a goddamn end. Is that the end of the article?
Yes.
Dang.
And like every other thing, this article didn't really have a purpose.
Yeah, I mean, rambling the same point over and over is one thing, but not even getting to a point really is quite another. Like at least if this was a Mary Sue article, she would go on to explain like what she meant by all of this. Even if it didn't make any fucking sense, there would at least be an attempt to have an argument with a premise, explanation, and conclusion.
I think it was all just premise, to be fair.
Yeah. And it was a very, very stupid premise that shows no understanding of comics and superheroes at all.
Right. Moving on.
Yep.
Right. Okay. So this is Marvel Studios celebrates the movies. This is basically just a big announcement of Phase 4, some footage from some of the things and other things. I'll be honest, me and Don, well, feel free to disagree with me, Don, if you think you
Yeah.
should.
Mhm.
I think we're not as super excited, just because there wasn't much shown here that really got us invested at all.
Yeah. They're not selling anything. And one of the things that bothered me about it was it seems like they're trying to get quote unquote back to basics, but in so doing they're treating it like the last 10 years worth of world building never happened. And that's really kind of stupid.
Mm-hmm.
Because the thing about Marvel being as successful as it was, and all the more power to them as far as I'm concerned, but they did change the game. And so you can't default back to the mindset you had in 2008 and expect people to just go, this is fine, because you, Marvel, told us to have higher expectations than that. You've been telling us that for basically 10 years via your output. So now you have to meet the expectations that you yourself raised. It's a little bit like Pixar. Before Pixar came out, computer animation was all but unheard of. But because Pixar and to a lesser extent DreamWorks kicks so much ass in the realm of computer animation, people now expect more of computer animation. So if something like I can't even think of a good example of a computer animated movie before Pixar. Um, but if something like um, I can't think of a proper example. If something like one of the software demos that they released before Toy Story came out was released today, people would be like, "What the fuck is this?" Um, because Pixar and DreamWorks have shown us that computer animation can work and can work really well for really great stories. Well, likewise, Marvel, you almost single-handedly proved that the superhero genre can stand on its own and can go the weird places that comic book fans want it to go. So you can't act as though it's still 2008 anymore. You've changed the game. Now you've got to play by your own rules,
Mm-hmm.
is the long and short of it. Banana.
Ah.
I love being with people. It's the most incredible thing in the world.
What are you doing? Oh, this is nice.
That world may change and evolve, but the one thing that will never change.
Stanley's always a win.
Yes. Ding.
Overall, they don't care what the footage is being shown because
Yeah. It's pre-existing footage, so it doesn't really rate much comment.
Yeah.
Although after WandaVision, I'll just say Wanda and Vision being together is also always a win. Ding.
Banana.
Banana.
One thing that will never change. We're all part of one big family. We are Groot. That man next to you.
Still got nothing to say other than like a lot of these movies I had more emotional impact than anything I've had in a very long time. So
Hmm. And honestly, hearing this voiceover from Stan Lee, it makes me really, really miss Stan Lee.
yeah.
Because I hadn't really thought of it for a while, but yeah, he is technically gone, and that's fucking terrible.
Mm-hmm.
Excelsior, Mr. Lee.
Excelsior.
And banana.
You. He's your brother. That woman over there, she's your sister.
Higher, further, faster, baby. That's right.
Oh, that ruined all the good vibes. Oh,
What's it is? I think Maria Rambeau was actually pretty cool.
yeah, it's just the black hole of smug standing next to her that just honestly, like, Bree and Carol, you both ruin everything. Go away. Go. Be gone. We have Monica Rambeau now, and she's awesome. And we don't need you anymore. Goodbye.
Banana.
Banana.
We're all part of one universe. That moves ever upward and onward to greater glory.
Yeah, I got none. Just
Yeah, no comment.
banana.
Although, thank you for using the best shot of Doctor Strange so far in the entire MCU.
Mm-hmm.
God, that was a good moment when he used the images of Icon for the first time on screen.
Banana.
Yeah, banana.
On your left.
Cool moment, but no comment really.
Yeah, it didn't really hit as hard as I think they wanted it to, for me at least.
You were just a picky bitch, so
Yeah.
Banana.
Banana.
Nothing.
Not yet.
Oh, no, I got nothing to say. This. Alright. Banana.
Banana.
I've lived a lot of lives. But I'm done running from my past. We have unfinished business. Who's we?
Okay. So Black Widow first.
Yeah, it looks good. It looks like female Jason Bourne, which is exactly what it should be. So
Honestly, more I feel like it's insulting it because Jason Bourne is not really great.
Well, true, but it doesn't really fit to call it female John Wick either. So, but it looks like a very sleek, stylish.
Mission Impossible.
It feels like a really sleek, stylish, like spy movie, which is what it should be. So,
Well, I'm getting Mission Impossible vibes, kind of.
yeah.
Yeah. I think this is the one I was kind of most excited to see.
Yeah, it still looks good as far as things go, and it's long overdue because this, honestly, like everyone said, this should have been in place of Captain Marvel.
Yeah. Honestly, we should have gone the movie in like phase 2.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Banana.
When you love something,
okay, well, Shang-Chi, I'm 50-50 on, like, it could be good, but
Yeah.
it could not be.
So far, I feel nothing. So far.
Yeah, like I said, I'm 50-50. I think again, we have to, like, see a little more stuff on it and maybe watch the actual movie itself.
Yeah.
For the record, we're probably not going to be reviewing anything unless we think it's warranted from Phase 4, just because, like,
yeah,
I'm not that interested nor really care. Like, Infinity War was just kind of not Endgame was kind of done for me, but I was done after Far From Home.
Yeah, because it broke Brainstormer. It broke him hard. They massacred your boy there.
Now we have something in common. So anyway, banana.
Yeah, banana.
when you love something, you fight for it. We're the ones who changed everything.
Okay.
Okay, and like I was saying to Brainstormer before we came on, my biggest problem with Eternals is most of the footage they have so far is just them standing in a field.
You know what? I'm kind of getting Old Guard vibes, like the Netflix Old Guard movie.
Kind of. And the problem is most of the important stuff for Eternals is stuff that needs to be rendered because it's a very CGI heavy concept, and most of the stuff that people are looking forward to with the Eternals is going to take some time to set up and to render. And not to mention, but the Eternals is like the second or third movie coming out in phase 4, so they're still at least a year away from actually doing anything substantive with it. So I'm fine with saying that most of my problems with it are because they haven't had enough time to render and set up things yet.
November 5th, 2021.
Yeah. So I'm fine with allowing for they just haven't had enough time to render things. Because I have seen a lot of the merchandise, in particular the art of the Celestials, and if they can come close to what they've been doing with the art, the concept art of the Celestials, I would be entirely game for all of that shit. But so far, it's just some very pretty people. God bless you.
Thank
some
you.
very pretty people, standing in a field, and that's Eternals does not make. So I will wait for the first trailer before I pass my eternal judgment on this. But I'm Jing.
Shut the fuck up. God damn it. That was your worst. That's the worst pun you ever done, man.
Oh, contraire.
Hands down.
I'm sure that status won't be eternal. I'm sure I'll come up with something worse.
I fucking hate you, man.
Yeah, I know.
Anyway, yeah, Banana.
But okay, can we back up and get a closer look at some of these dates, because it kind of annoys me that No Way Home came up before Multiverse of Madness did. Did they switch them around? I wasn't paying attention.
December 17th, 2021. I do not give a shit for Spider-Man No Way Home. Doctor Strange Multiverse of Madness. No, okay, hold on. Sorry.
No worries.
March 25th, 2022.
Okay, so they did. So wait. So No Way Home is coming out before Multiverse of Madness?
Yeah,
I thought the events of Multiverse of Madness is what led to No Way Home.
no, Far From Home led to No Way Home, remember?
Right, but
I don't care. I really don't.
No Way Home and Multiverse of Madness are supposed to constitute a multiverse trilogy with WandaVision and Eternals, and actually probably a quadrilogy with Quantumania
I don't care.
and Loki. Anyway, it's weird that they switched them, because originally No Way Home was supposed to come out after Multiverse of Madness, and then Wanda and Strange were supposed to show up in No Way Home. But anyway.
I don't care. The Marvels 2022.
AKA it was Captain Marvel 2, but then we realized people's reaction to Captain Marvel, and we realized she needed help. So yay, Carol got demoted.
Ant-Man and the Wasp, February 17th, 2023. Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania. I don't care.
I'm excited for this one because Kang is supposed to be the villain, and
They're gonna make him a joke.
I like the idea of exploring the quantum realm as long as they keep the scientific stuff confined to Spider-Man and Ant-Man and leave the mystical stuff to Doctor Strange. I hope.
Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, May 5th, 2023.
My only problem with that so far is I think it's kind of stupid to introduce Adam Warlock after the Infinity Saga, but I'd rather have him, so I will forgive it if it's good. And James Gunn deserves good things. So yay.
I don't care anymore.
And Fantastic Four does not yet have a release date. But we're getting them at some point.
I'm going to play this real quick. I'm going to play this real quick. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, no, it's I don't care anymore. I really don't.
There's potential for at least some of these. Some of these I will definitely be skipping, like Shang-Chi.
You say
but
you know you're actually going to watch it.
Well, it really really depends on what the first full trailer and the second trailer are like. If I see more kung fu mysticism weirdness, then yes, I will change my tune on Shang-Chi. But if it remains as it is, then I reserve the right to pirate the shit out of it. Yo. Uh, I am excited for Eternals because motherfucking Celestial finally, and probably set up for Elder Gods because because Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness. And I am excited for Ant-Man 3 because it's probably going to form kind of a stealth trilogy or stealth quadrilogy with Eternals, Doctor Strange 2, Spider-Man No Way Home, and Ant-Man and Quantumania. So that's exciting. I am excited for Thor 4 because guy who played Javert in Les Miserables, and I can't remember his name, was also Jor-El in Man of Steel.
Oh, Russell Crowe.
Russell Crowe, thank you. I
Oh.
was getting him and Kurt Russell confused there for a second. But Russell Crowe is confirmed to be playing Zeus, which means Skyfathers, possibly, which is a win. Plus, the acknowledgement of multiple pantheons existing is also a win. So, and Taika Waititi is going to be in it, and I trust him. And Kevin Feige said they were going to go full Jack Kirby this time, and that Ragnarok was just kind of putting their dipping their toe in the water of Kirbyism. So yes, please turn the Kirbyism all the way up to an 11, if you please.
I again, like I'm just kind of done with Marvel at this point because I don't know. It just seems like it's makes promises it can't really fulfill on. You know.
And that is a worry of mine. I am very, very worried because there's maybe 5 ways they could do this correctly, and about 500 that they could fuck it up.
Right.
I feel a little bit like Doctor Strange during Infinity War, looking at all the possible futures and only seeing one that works out well. But that being said, I'm still holding out hope that we'll somehow land in the positive timeline. I hope.
Mm-hmm. All right. So with that, folks, I want to say goodbye, adios, aloha, auf Wiedersehen, sayonara, peace, cheers, and
we're tired, so fuck off.